James Earl Carter, a leader of vision or a man who tried the toughest job in the world and failed.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me? I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
Carter's been president for almost 4 years. What Americans are now asking themselves is, how much has he achieved? How much has he learned since this solemn inauguration in January 1977? And when the next president is sworn in, is this the scene they want repeated?
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Carter.
As incumbent president, Carter should be in the lead, but he's in deep trouble. Even so, he can still command a cheering welcome wherever he speaks. This was a major gathering of black Americans in Miami, Florida.
Let me say, first of all, that it's great to be here. As you can see, I did not have any trouble accepting my invitation to come to the NAACP convention.
In the last election, Carter's victory over Gerald Ford depended heavily on black votes. This time, too, he looks certain to pick up more black support than his current Republican rival, Ronald Reagan. But nationwide, he's trailing badly in the opinion polls. There's a widespread feeling that Carter has been an indecisive leader who's left America poorer and weaker than when he found it. So the black vote still needs energetic wooing. And in this largely middle-class gathering, his efforts are appreciated.
And you can depend on that.
Outside, it's different. Miami recently saw some of America's worst racial violence, and many blacks are still angry. Jobs, discrimination, police repression. They're all issues on which they feel Carter has betrayed them, making promises he never kept. In a nutshell, they say that being black in America is still a problem, and that's not what they were led to expect when they bought the Carter package 4 years ago.
Justice! Now!
True or not, the atmosphere today is very different from Carter's first campaign, when he sought the presidency with such boundless optimism.
Now here comes the train right now down the tracks. Now let's wait until it pulls in. Let's give Carter, Governor Carter, a real Philadelphia welcome.
Carter's 1976 campaign was in many ways a masterpiece of political engineering. As governor of Georgia, he'd achieved relatively little national exposure. So he came to the voters as a virtual unknown, unskilled in the ways of Washington, and with no direct experience in the tangle of world affairs. Jimmy Who, they called him when he first announced his candidacy. The achievement of his campaign was to make these drawbacks look like positive assets. To a nation still reeling from Watergate, he came over as a man of impeccable morals and integrity who would bring a welcome breath of idealism into the cynical world of Capitol Hill. In his own words, he wanted to offer the nation a government as decent and as full of love as the American people themselves. Carter's idealism was rooted in his religion. The would-be president was a born-again Baptist, and he wanted the world to know about it.
And good is her greatness. In the spirit of him who is the way we pray. Amen.
During the campaign, though, there was a curious and revealing incident. It was discovered that the church Carter attended in his hometown of Plains had closed its doors to black people. Carter claimed ignorance and innocence and helped to change the rules. But judged by his own high standards, the incident revealed a strange lack of awareness and raised doubts about his ability to put his principles into practice. Carter's highly visible morality had a habit of rebounding on him. In an interview with Playboy magazine, he admitted he'd committed adultery in his heart, if not in deed. He was only being honest, but at the time he was misunderstood. His friends say that's often the case with his so-called gaffes.
I am used to it. Who are you? Who are you?
One person, though, has always understood him.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much.
For his mother, universally known as Ms. Lillian, Jimmy Carter holds no mysteries, and she simply can't see why people find him hard to understand.
I think a lot of people are real dumb because we understand Jimmy. I think it's a difference in the part of the country you're from, but I don't see why everybody can understand him. He makes everything so plain to me.
Has he got any particular bad habits that you're going to tell him to say, when you get to the White House, be careful about that?
No, Jimmy has no bad habits. This is funny. Everybody's trying to find out something bad about Jimmy. It's impossible. There's just nothing bad about him.
Right.
And I'm not just this prejudiced. You can ask everybody who comes to this church or who's in town.
Is it true to say, though, he's a rather complicated person?
I think everybody says that about him, but really, to me, he's not complicated. He's just plain old Jimmy.
Plain old Jimmy was born to a modest farming family in southwest Georgia. It was a barefoot childhood, but Jimmy was a receptive student, becoming the first member of his family to graduate from high school. Photos around this time show him to be already a serious, idealistic young man. In 1946, he married a former schoolmate, Rosalind Smith, and graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. He spent several years on battleships and submarines before joining America's elite nuclear submarine force. The naval career ended with his father's death when Jimmy returned to run the family farm. Business prospered, and by the late 1950s, he could afford to turn his attention from peanuts to politics.
This common effort is a prerequisite to victory. Ours is a great party.
Carter was elected to the Georgia Senate in 1962. 4 years later, he was state governor. He was seen as an effective leader who did a lot to reorganize the state's finances and welfare services. When it came to the 1976 campaign, Carter's image as a successful, hard-working peanut farmer had powerful voter appeal, and he did all he could to promote it. Accused of being a political outsider, he pleaded guilty. Insiders, he claimed, had had their chances, and they'd failed to deliver the goods.
Jimmy Carter knows what it's like to work for a living. Until he became governor, he put in 12 hours a day in his shirt sleeves during harvest at his farm. Can you imagine any of the other candidates for president working in the hot August sun? That's why Jimmy Carter has a special understanding of the problems facing everyone who works for a living. America needs someone like this as president. Vote for Jimmy Carter in your Democratic primary.
Carter's hometown of Plains proved a more effective base than Gerald Ford's White House, and the promise was that the values he'd learned here were the ones he'd be taking with him to Washington. It was going to mean big changes in American policy, both at home and abroad.
Our commitment to human rights must be absolute. Our laws fair, our natural beauty preserved. The powerful must not persecute the weak, and human dignity must be enhanced. We are a proudly idealistic nation, but let no one confuse our idealism with weakness. Because we are free, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere.
Putting those ideals into practice was to prove difficult. Carter's lack of knowledge of the Washington machine created problems that simply couldn't be brushed aside by mere good intentions. Putting Congress on TV made little impact on Carter's promise of open government, and it certainly didn't stop complaints from congressmen themselves. Many of them accused the new team of confusion, high-handedness, and sheer bad management.
Will provide for a program to determine the feasibility of collecting in space solar energy to be transferred.
Congress was dominated by Carter's own party, the Democrats, but as the president fumbled for the levers of power, Congress turned against him. It happened over his first and most important target in domestic policy, an issue he himself saw as the moral equivalent of war. The president created an ambitious energy plan, but Congress hated it, and so did the people. As the tank full got dearer, American motorists blamed Carter for letting oil companies make massive profits during the crisis. In the end, though, the president won through, with new taxes on imports and fresh incentives for domestic production. Carter's biggest domestic challenge at the moment is America's ailing economy. Industries such as steel and automobiles are especially badly hit. Detroit's producing the cars, but can't sell them, as the recession bites deep into consumer spending. Part of the problem is that imported cars are more economical and therefore more attractive in an age of expensive fuel. But productivity is down, and not just in the auto industry. The president's promised that if he's granted a second term, he'll revitalize industry with tax cuts, fewer regulations, and direct federal assistance. All that's for the future. But for the present, workers all over America are more concerned about the security of their jobs than they've been in decades. And they've good reason to worry. Throughout the Carter presidency, unemployment has risen steadily to nearly 8%. And though it's recently begun to drop slightly, that's going to be small consolation to a president who made full employment one of the main themes of his election campaign. There was another monster that candidate Carter vowed to kill, but it's still very much alive and growing. For decades, Americans have assumed that inflation was something that happened elsewhere. It might reach 100% in Latin America, but at home it always stayed in single figures. Inconvenient at times, but manageable. In the Carter years, that picture's begun to change. This year, inflation reached a painful 18 to 20%. It's dropping slightly now, but again not by enough to do Carter any good. His promises were for a balanced budget, but this year, the deficit's likely to be over $60 billion. Next year's could be just as bad. For many Americans, most of these economic woes can be blamed on an indecisive government. One example they give is the policy on credit. Only a few months ago, Washington was squeezing credit hard. Now it's alarmed by the consumer slump, so it's once again urging people to use their little plastic cards to the full. In foreign policy, President Carter's most acclaimed achievement has been his Middle East diplomacy, the Camp David agreement that culminated last year in the signing of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. There's no doubt this was an astonishing breakthrough. Although Nixon and Kissinger had paved the way by bringing Egypt into the US orbit, Carter could justifiably claim the credit. Like Sadat and Begin, he'd risked his political reputation to achieve it. And that, say his friends, is the real Jimmy Carter. When the chips are down, they say, he's daring and decisive. His sister Ruth, visiting Jerusalem in the wake of the Camp David triumph, put it this way.
Well, I think it's my brother's nature to take risk. From the very beginning, in his early days of politics, he's been one that would always take the aggressive step to step out if he thought that it would bring gain in some way for peace, for better government, or for the good of the people. So to me, it's true to his nature.
Carter's daring did not reach as far as the Palestinians. The PLO's Yasser Arafat called it a dirty deal, and he was backed by most of the rest of the Arab world. This made it more essential than ever for America to keep firm control of the peace initiative. But Israel went its own way by continuing to build Israeli settlements on the occupied West Bank. Early this year, a UN resolution called on Israel to dismantle them. America voted for it. Then, in an astonishing about-face, Carter declared it had been a mistake, and he reversed the decision. His opponents saw it as a shameful cave-in to Israeli pressure. It was different in Panama, where Carter pressed ahead with the treaty to restore the canal to Panamanian sovereignty. Just one example, he now claims, of how his administration carried out necessary policies, however controversial. Elsewhere in Latin America, Carter's progress was patchy. As civil war raged in Nicaragua, Washington dropped dictator Anastasio Somoza. His regime had been staunchly anti-communist, but it was also corrupt and brutal. And in the light of Carter's commitment to human rights, the US could no longer call him friend. The Sandinist rebels, who fought their way to power, owed far more to Cuba than Washington would have liked. But the administration still marks Nicaragua down as a qualified success, where principle triumphed despite the political cost. The price rose even higher as revolution in Nicaragua spurred on a similar struggle in nearby El Salvador. Again, a dictator was ousted, but this time the new regime was a military-civilian junta whose declared aim was to steer a middle course between the extremists. It promised many radical reforms, including nationalization of the banks and some badly needed redistribution of land. On the strength of that, Carter decided to back it with American aid. It was a controversial decision whose wisdom is still in question. It was based on the judgment that left-wing rebels here had less support from the people than the Sandinists had had in Nicaragua. But the brutality of the junta forces has grown to match that of the rebels. Washington's main hope now is that American aid will show itself in better training and greater discipline. In Cuba, the president got into terrible trouble. Last year, he sent the Marines into Guantanamo Bay on a simulated invasion. Only weeks before, he'd claimed US intelligence had discovered a Soviet armored brigade in Cuba. The Soviets said it was only a training unit and had been there 17 years. Carter insisted their presence was unacceptable, but he accepted it. Cuba was a headache elsewhere. In the Horn of Africa, Castro's troops helped Ethiopia fight secession in Eritrea and Ogaden. As in Angola earlier, the Cubans were seen as Soviet mercenaries using Soviet arms. Carter was determined to avoid any military confrontation, but he did try to act by linking events in the Horn with the SALT II disarmament talks with the Soviet Union. His message was, progress in the talks would be slow if the troops weren't withdrawn. Once again, though, he had to back down. And when he met Soviet leader Brezhnev in Vienna last year, Cubans were still active in Africa. For his critics, it was just one more example of the president drawing a line and then failing to hold it. Beyond that, there were many who felt that the SALT II treaty put America at a dangerous disadvantage in the nuclear arms race. From the beginning of his presidency, Carter had made détente with the Soviet Union his major objective in foreign policy. He saw strategic disarmament as inevitable once the Soviets had caught up with American weapons technology. But his critics felt he didn't understand Soviet thinking, and they feared that his own high idealism would lead him to believe that others were fired by the same motives. The suspicion was that he'd given away too much at a time when Soviet power was on the increase worldwide. One man tested Carter's mettle to the utmost, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. The Iranian Revolution unleashed forces way beyond the control of any American diplomacy. The calls for vengeance stemmed from policies the Carter administration had merely inherited. For Carter, of course, the main challenge was the seizure of the US embassy and the hostages. The president tried everything, from persuasion by special envoys to trade embargoes, but the Iranians remained defiant. After more than a year of accumulated outrage and humiliation, the president took direct action, and it was a disaster. Any hopes of snatching the hostages to safety perished in the desert of eastern Iran, along with the rescue aircraft and 8 crew members. Mechanical failure was the prime cause, but the finger of blame soon pointed at the president. The mission had been launched before economic sanctions had had a chance to bite. It had been poorly funded and planned, and even if it had reached its target, the anticipated death toll would have been unacceptably high. The president's other major challenge was Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion came as a shock, which forced a complete reappraisal of Carter's stand on human rights and East-West relations. He called it the biggest threat to peace since World War II. The SALT II agreement, already in difficulties in Congress, was put into cold storage. Carter had promised never to use food as a weapon, but his ban on grain exports was hastily conceived. Russia made up supplies from elsewhere, notably Argentina, annoyed by Carter's criticisms on human rights. There was anxiety, too, over Pakistan, now dangerously exposed. Carter sent Security Advisor Brzezinski to assess how much American help should be provided for the unpopular regime of President Zia. The offer was $400 million, and despite his smiles, the Pakistani leader dismissed it contemptuously as peanuts.
But you and I are men in the same spirit.
All these policies have been carried out by a man who is in practice the leader not just of the United States, but of the Western world. America's relationship with its Western allies has always been a complex one, and now, more than ever, there's a need for consistency and consultation. The allies claim that from Carter, they have not had enough of either. As a result, they're taking their own initiatives, on the Middle East, for example, despite Carter's opposition. Some European leaders, notably West Germany's Helmut Schmidt, have scarcely attempted to conceal their dismay over Carter's performance. In 4 years, Carter's lost 3 important colleagues. Budget Director Bert Lance was first to go, accused of violating banking rules in private deals. Carter believed him innocent, but had to accept his resignation in the end.
I have been director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Andrew Young, America's ambassador to the United Nations, got into all kinds of hot water with his outspoken comments. There were repeated calls for his resignation, but the president stood by him until he was accused of having conducted negotiations with a Palestinian official. Young maintained it had been a chance meeting, but he was forced to quit, ironically on the one issue where many people felt he could and should have been supported. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance brought long experience and careful diplomacy to the Carter team. But he felt the president failed to give him his rightful status. And when Carter ignored his advice by launching the Iran rescue, Vance had no alternative but to resign. One appointment Jimmy Carter did get right was his wife, Rosalind. Over 34 years of marriage, she's come to be one of his most trusted political advisors, a knowledgeable, ambitious woman who can often replace him when needed. It's been a different story, though, with his younger brother, Billy. When this film was taken 4 years ago, Billy was seen as an amusing curiosity, a complete contrast to the president.
Tourists hear the crowds, and I like things the way it was before. Frankly, I wouldn't like to see motels. I'm kind of in the minority, but I wouldn't like to see it.
Over the years, Billy developed into an embarrassment with his earthy, often crude pronouncements on life and politics. He got involved in all kinds of dubious publicity gimmicks and had to undergo treatment for alcoholism. Recently, though, his status as a paid agent of Libya made him the biggest single threat to his brother's political future. And it wasn't just fans of Jimmy who felt that this so-called Billygate affair would be an ironic and unhappy end to his presidency. Towards the end, it was clear that 4 years in office had changed the president. After the trials of Iran and the shock of Afghanistan, he started a major program of flexing America's military muscles. Back home, there was registration for conscription. Abroad, there was a search for military bases in the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and military exercises like this in the Philippines to demonstrate America's ability to defend its vital foreign interests. After 4 years of immense difficulties and challenges, Jimmy Carter's still smiling. The vast fund of optimism he brought with him to the White House has not been entirely depleted. But he knows from the opinion polls that many Americans feel he's let them down. So much so that at one point his popularity dropped below Richard Nixon's at the lowest ebb of Watergate. In one sense, that verdict is an insult to a man who brought to the presidency such high idealism and deep religious faith. On another view, though, that could be precisely the problem. Jimmy Carter came to the White House with the dust of his peanut fields on his feet and led the nation to believe that all that was needed from a president was honesty, decency, and concern for human rights. It says as much about the world as about Jimmy Carter that many people feel that these values alone are not enough.